Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you today. I hope that you are all doing well. I spent time this week on Zoom with some students in Ukraine. And I expressed that I'd make sure to tell you all that we need to make sure that we're praying for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and across the globe. Throughout this week, many of us will spend time being thankful for what we have and thankful for the opportunities that we have and the freedoms that we have and the security that we have. And we should be thankful for those things. But in the midst of our thankfulness, we should also take a moment and be mindful of those who might not have all the things that we have at the moment to be thankful for, and make sure that we keep them in our prayers. I want you to take a moment and look around you just for a moment this morning. Now look around and see all the different faces that are there. Make sure to look behind you too, because if you're up here, there's people behind you. Yes, they saw your bald spot. It's okay. No, I'm serious. Take a moment, look around, see the different faces, the different walks of life that we've taken. What a beautiful, magnificent opportunity to come together as the family of God, despite the differences that we do have. For we all come from different backgrounds. We have different families, different experiences. And yet, despite our differences, there are many things that unite us, many things that we have in common. For example, like it or not, we are all going to pay taxes. We are all in need of food and shelter and clothing. We all need Jesus. And we all, at some point in time, will inevitably experience grief. There are two types of grief, realized grief and anticipatory grief. Realized grief is grief that has come as a result of a loss that has already occurred. Anticipatory grief is grief about a loss that will occur. So for example, if you find out that you have a terminal illness, you might begin to experience an element of grief because you're thinking about what will happen in the future. But both are types of grief, and both recognize an aspect of loss. Usually when we talk in terms of grief, we think about the loss of a loved one, and undoubtedly that is grief. But grief is not limited to merely the loss of a loved one. It is a response to any type of loss. It might be the loss of a job, it might be the loss of a relationship, it might be the loss of a pet. Any type of loss can bring about grief. For grief is a response to trying to see, how do we live now? How do we live in recognition of life is different? And that word, loss, so short, so simple, so clean. And it fails to fully convey the reality that loss is an attempt to work with the pain and the turmoil and everything that it comes about as a result of losing something. And what makes grief so challenging is that it's an attempt to put pieces back together, the pieces of our lives, knowing that we will forever have some pieces missing. I want us to read this text together, Isaiah 53, 3 through 4. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Isaiah 53 is a messianic prophecy. It records how Jesus will come, how he will bear the pain of our sin, how he will bear the punishment of our sin, and that which we deserved, he will take on himself, and that which he earned, we will be blessed with. Yet in the midst of this messianic prophecy, we also read some of how Jesus will live. And notice that the text indicates that he was acquainted with grief. Acquainted with so much grief that he could be described as a man of sorrows. Jesus is our example in all things. And so today we're going to take a moment and look at how did Jesus interact with grief? And perhaps as we look at his example, we too might learn how we can move through grief and how we might help others move through grief as well. Now at this point you might be asking, preacher, don't you know it's Thanksgiving? Yes, I do. I'm already hungry. You might be asking, why are we talking about grief as we look forward to that time when we're going to be thankful? Well, it turns out that the time of year when grief is at its apex is around the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. Because it's the time when we are reminded of that which we have lost, whether it be a person or something throughout this year, that we're reminded of that which we have lost. And throughout this month, we are talking about family, for this is Family Emphasis Month. We want to talk about the nuclear family as well as the family of God, talk about how we might grow our individual families, but also talk about how we as the family of God might minister to and might help support other families that are in our midst. For we are family, which means that we are to be there in the good times and the challenging times as well. So this morning we're going to look at not only how we might move through grief, but how we as the family of God might help one another move through grief. Turn, if you will, to John chapter 11. John chapter 11. And I wonder, how many Bibles do we have? How many Bibles are there? What a fantastic sight. I'm so thankful that we have the opportunity to read the Word of God together. John chapter 11. And I want us to look at verses 17 through 35. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Notice those 2 little words, Jesus wept. Now, from those 2 little words, we arrive at a question. Why did Jesus cry? Prior to this particular text, Jesus has made it clear that he is coming to raise Lazarus from the dead, that he knew Lazarus was going to die, and that he was coming to raise him from the dead. And he knew that in just a few moments, when he uttered those words, Lazarus come out. He knew there would be great rejoicing and a great party at what had taken place. And yet here he weeps. Why? Because Jesus is not unmoved by our grief. And he grieves at the reality that we have to go through grief, that we have to experience loss within this world. And the first lesson that we learn is that Jesus welcomes our grief and that he grieves with us. Regardless of how our grief looks. For did you notice the difference between how Mary and Martha grieved? Did you notice that they reacted to Jesus and his presence a little bit differently? They both asked the same question. But did you notice that Martha goes and meets Jesus before he makes it into the city? I wonder if perhaps Martha might have been just a little bit angry. And I wonder if her statement was not so much, "Jesus, where were you?" but rather, "Where were you? Why were you not here?" There's this element of anger, of marching out and confronting, "Where were you when I needed you?" Mary, on the other hand, seems so burdened by the sorrow that she's experiencing, that she cannot be moved until someone comes and gets her and brings her to Jesus. They both ask the same question, but in very different ways. And notice that in both cases, Jesus engages their grief without any condemnation, but allows them to grieve in the way that they found themselves grieving. That Jesus welcomed their grief. For those of you who find yourself in the midst of grief as we move towards Thanksgiving, Jesus welcomes the grief that you have and wants you to come to him with that grief. For those of us who have someone in our families that will be at our table this Thanksgiving, we need to welcome the grief that they might very well express, regardless of how it manages to manifest itself. But choose to engage it and, most importantly, to listen to it. Second example that we see from Jesus is found in Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. And here we will see that Jesus took time to grieve. I want us to read verses 13 and 14 first. Now when Jesus heard this, pause. What did Jesus hear? Jesus has just found out that his cousin, John the Baptist, was beheaded by King Herod. Has just found out that his beloved cousin, his cousin just a few months older than he is, has died. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Pause. Why did Jesus withdraw and go by himself? Because he just found out that his cousin died and he wanted some time by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And notice what takes place. Jesus' grief is interrupted. Something takes place. In this case, he sees a crowd that is like sheep without a shepherd, and he has compassion on them. His grief is interrupted, and he chooses to engage with what he saw was more important for that particular moment. But fast forward to verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat, go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. I wonder what that prayer was like. I suspect that it was a prayer of grief. For recall the order of events. Jesus just found out that his beloved cousin has passed. He's paused his grief for a moment to address the needs of the crowd, but he still needs to take time to grieve. And so he goes up on a mountainside by himself to be alone and to pray. What we learn is that we need to take time to grieve, that it's okay to grieve, and that we must take time to grieve. For there's a general principle that is true, that we will all grieve. It's not really a matter of if, but rather when and how. For either our grief will come out in a productive way, that is leading us towards how we might begin to put pieces back together, or it will come out in an unproductive way, in which case we will likely lash out at everyone around us or descend into some kind of deep depression. That we must grieve. And so if around your Thanksgiving table this week there is someone there who is in the midst of grief, not only do you need to be there to listen, but to be there to give permission to grieve and to encourage them to grieve, just as Jesus himself took time to grieve. The third thing we learn is that Jesus cried out to God. Matthew chapter 27. Verses 45 and 46. Jesus currently is hanging on the cross. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus has already made it abundantly clear, at least 3 times in Matthew, and explicitly stated that he is going to go to the cross, that he is going to die, and that he is going to be raised from the dead. He's made it abundantly clear what's going to take place. Ephesians tells us that this was the plan from the foundation of the world. Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew what was coming, and yet here on the cross, he cries out, my God, why is this happening? Why does he ask that question when he already knew the answer? Why does he ask, my God, where are you, when he already knew? I wonder if there's 2 reasons. One, to express the distance that he felt from his Father as he took on the sins of the world and became sin so that we might have life. But I suspect there's a second reason too. To display his humanity. For in that moment, he finds himself asking the same question that we as humans do. Why? For grief has a way of bringing questions to our mind of why has this happened? Why now? What am I supposed to do now? It has a way of bringing questions up to the surface. Questions that at times are hard to find answers for, and sometimes questions that have no answers. It's the same question that Job will ask throughout the book of Job as he asks God, why has this happened to me? I haven't done anything to deserve this. Why has this happened? And at the end of the book, Job is declared to be a righteous man because he took those questions with really no answer, those questions for which Job never gets an answer, but he takes those questions to God just as Jesus expresses why. What we learn is that in the midst of grief, with those questions that sometimes bubble to the surface that are hard to answer, that we are to take those questions to our God. Sometimes we'll get answers for them. Sometimes we might even already know the answer. And sometimes there may be no answer at all. But we are to take those questions to our God and wrestle and grapple with our grief in conversation with him. If you find yourself at your Thanksgiving table with someone who you know is in the midst of grief, do your best to help them begin a conversation with the one who grants comfort, with the one who grants peace, with the one who grants healing. For only in him do we find answers to questions of life, and only in him do we find peace when there are no good answers to the questions that we ask. In grief, we are to take those feelings, those questions to our God. The fourth thing that we learn from Jesus' example is that he leaned on others. I want us to back up to Matthew chapter 26. Beginning in verse 36. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. It describes Jesus' state and the sorrow and the grief and the overwhelming feeling that he was experiencing in that moment. Earlier we read how Jesus took time to grieve, specifically take time to grieve by himself. But here we learn that Jesus not only sometimes took time to grieve by himself, but also took time to lean upon others and share the feelings and the grief that he had with others. In the midst of grief, we can often find ourselves feeling isolated. For grief has an isolating tendency where we often want to go off and be by ourselves and only be by ourselves, and there's a time for that. But it's also a time to be with others and not try and be entirely on our own. A time to express the feelings and the questions we have in grief. And a time to express and reminisce about the memories that we have. If we find ourselves in the midst of grief, we need to take time to be around others and to lean upon others. And if at your Thanksgiving table this week, there is someone there who is in the midst of grief, oftentimes when people who are in grief express their grief to us, we find ourselves uncertain of what to do. When we search for some statement that we can make, some phrase that we can present that'll just make everything better, that'll somehow shine a bright light and suddenly all the darkness will be gone. We feel a little bit helpless. But the reality is that there is no phrase to make everything better. There are no words that shine a light removing all the darkness. The best thing that we can do is often to just simply be there. To just simply allow our presence to communicate that we care. And perhaps to even ask questions, especially if it's the loss of a loved one. Tell me about this person. Tell me about the memories that you have about them. Tell me about your love for them. Tell me what you wish you could tell them now. To simply be there in the midst of that dark time with them, allowing them to lean upon us and share the memories that they have. For just as Jesus needed to lean on others in his grief, so we need to lean upon others in our grief as well. Lastly, Jesus always remembered where he was going. John chapter 14. Verses 1 through 4. Jesus has just expressed to his disciples that he is going to leave them and that he is going to a place where they cannot follow. And Jesus responds with this: "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am you may also go. And you know the way to where I am going." Jesus never forgot where he had come from and where he was going to. He never forgot the mission that he had, and he never forgot that ultimately, even after he went through all of the pain and the agony and all that he faced, he knew where he would eventually go to. And here, he reminds his disciples, despite the fact that he knows that they are about to encounter grief, for he's going to leave them. He reminds them of the reality that he will come again. And what we learn is that thank God there will be one day where we have no more grief. Thank God there will be one day when there is no more pain. Thank God there will be one day when there are no more tears. And thank God there will be one day where we never experience loss again. In the midst of our grief, we look forward to that wonderful, magnificent day when he will wipe away all of our tears. And our grief reminds us to look forward to it all the more. There's a poem that I'd like to read for you. It's a poem that you have likely heard before. It's a poem entitled "Footprints in the Sand." It's one that's often read with regards to grief, but yet it's hard to find anything better that summarizes the reality of what takes place in the midst of our grief. One night I had a dream. I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord, and across the sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene I noticed two sets of footprints in the sand. One belonged to me and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of my life flashed before us, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that many times along the path of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times in my life. This really bothered me, and I questioned the Lord about it. "Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you would walk with me all the way. But I noticed that during the most troublesome times in my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why in times when I needed you the most, you should leave me. The Lord replied, my precious, precious child, I love you, and I would never, never leave you during your times of trial and suffering. When you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. Perhaps there is no time in life when the Lord carries us more than in those times of grief. In those times when we're not really sure that we can continue on ourselves. It is those times as we bring our grief to him, remembering what lies ahead, that he picks us up and he carries us and helps us to be able to move through. Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most. That relationship begins at baptism, and there's nothing that would excite us more than to help you start that journey. Or perhaps you're here today and you're just worn out and overwhelmed, and you want the prayers of the church. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.